Hello there.
Welcome back. I'm Mary Thaler.
And I'm Geoffrey Edwards, and this is Writing Off the Deep End.
Well, today we're going to be talking about something that's very specific to our context, but hopefully also applicable to other writers out there.
Right, which is the fact that we live and work in a language that isn't our native tongue. So for us it's French from an English background, but obviously there are many other contexts in the world where that would be the case. That could be the case.
Now, confession, I do almost all my creative writing in English, and I think that my French is pretty good. My very kind French-speaking friends tell me that it's good, but then they do sometimes ask me, "Oh, and do you write stories in French?" And I usually have to tell them that writing fiction takes a level of comfort with a language that is very far beyond what I need for a conversation or even a technical or scientific report.
Yeah, I think that I can relate to that. Although my experience is somewhat different. When I moved to Quebec City, well, maybe not right away, but after a certain time, I wanted to be able to write in French.
Yeah.
And so I worked on my written French. I hired someone to help me with my written French. We went over texts and corrected them. And I've also taken classes in written French. And all of that raised my level of written French. Now, part of that was because some of the scientific papers I was writing were in French. Yeah. And I needed to be sufficiently good in French to be able to write these papers. But I was also interested in writing, well, poetry and fiction.
And so, but you did it.
I did. I wrote one short story that was published in French, a science fiction short story. And I wrote several poems that were also published in French. But recently I was asked by somebody to write a text, and would I like to contribute a fictional chapter to his book? And I said yes, and the story came out in French.
Yeah.
I will have it revised. I would never submit, well, even in English I have it revised, so it needs somebody to go over it to make sure, to clean up the language a bit. Yeah. Another thing that's happened is that, so I wrote a book, a draft of a book in September last year, which is the first book of the trilogy that I've been working on dealing with the Second World War, which was about a Jewish family fleeing Brussels in the Second World War in order to escape from the Nazi-occupied France. And in the meantime, I've met somebody who is Belgian and whose father was in that situation of fleeing the Nazis. And they're Francophone. And so I thought I would like to share my story with them. Yes. But the story is written in English. So I've been looking into translating it into French for them. Yeah. And I've done the first translation myself, and I'm having a reviser go through the text and clean it up so that it's in proper French. Yeah. So again, a second level of work in French.
And I think you've touched on something important. There can be lots of reasons when you choose what language you're writing in. There can be lots of reasons to choose one or the other. Sometimes, as you say, it just comes in the language. But a very important thing is this question of access, and what writing do we have access to, and who do we want, is it important to give people access to our writing? Because language can be a wall, a barrier, and there's a kind of siloization that happens where we just sit in the literature and the literary community of our language. And English can be particularly bad because there is a sort of hegemony. But I think it maybe bears saying, I think that this is part of modern writing and part of the future. Many of the writers in English now that we are reading, English is not their first language. They are, in fact, writing in their second language. Several famous writers have made that jump to write primarily in their second language. Joseph Conrad was Polish, I believe, and wrote in English. Samuel Beckett was Irish and wrote in French. And so I think there's a very very cool thing happening when you make an effort to reach across a language barrier. Whether you feel confident in your skills or not, just reaching out is important.
So one of the things that, a comment that was made, so I've read some of my work in my writing in scientific conferences, and those are in the room who listen, whether they're Francophone or Anglophone, claim or tell me that the English writing has a rhythm to it that is wonderful to listen to. And that the French, when I write in French, you don't get those rhythms. The rhythms when I write in French are not quite right for French, but not English either. And so there's something else. Yeah. So that sort of worries me a little bit about the French. But Mary and I met a Quebec writer last year. When you read his books, they have this slight rhythm that's not quite the way an English person would write. But it works. It doesn't have to be wrong because it doesn't have the natural rhythms of the language of the person speaking. So that sort of reconciles me to the idea that one can write in a language other than one's birth language and still do something that's worthwhile with it. You mentioned you've done some translation. That's also a translation in the other direction, that is sort of, which is the normal direction, because
you always translate towards your birth language, or towards the language that you are more comfortable in. So I do French to English.
Right, except unless you're crazy like me and do it the other way around. But
well, some people have skills. But it's been a very interesting experience. Some rules that I had internalized for good English writing don't necessarily apply to writing in French. So I still remember in high school getting taught not to use comma splices. That was, I had a teacher who was very firm on that. Every time she saw a comma splice, big red circle. Comma splice is not incorrect in French, as far as I can tell. It's a perfectly considered a very legitimate way to organize your sentence.
Yeah. Another thing in French, so not at the sentence level, but the paragraph level, they often announce the subject right at the beginning, and then the explanation follows. In English, we usually explain things, and then we summarize at the end. We rarely announce. So, I mean, for years, reading theses in French, it's been an issue for me, because I read this thing and there's like no motivation in sight for the statement, but the motivation follows.
Right.
So that's another difference between French and English in style. For you, does it, when you translate, do you keep the wrong structures, or do you...
I could not. My grade 10 teacher would be rolling in her grave. I take out the comma splices. But am I right to do that? I don't know.
That's the question. Is
that my prejudice?
Yeah. So, I mean, as a translator, you are allowed a certain liberty, though.
And there's different schools of thought about translation. Nabokov, who translated lots of books from Russian to English, said that his philosophy was that you should preserve the strangeness.
Yes, that's what I kind of think too, that you want to keep something about it.
But not all translators think that way. Some of them say, well, no, the reader should not be paying attention to the language. We need to pull them into the story. And I think that's legitimate. I think both of those could be correct.
So are you going to write in French after our conversation? Are you going to be pulled that way?
It is a goal of mine. One has the sensation that stepping into another language can free you to write things that you wouldn't have written in your first language.
Well, I do know that my writing in French is different from my writing in English.
Really? So how?
Well, first of all, French as a language, it's a bit more long-winded. In some ways, it's more precise. To use a word in French, you have to use it in a particular way. You're not allowed a lot of leeway in how you use a word. Whereas in English, you can get away with using words in all sorts of ways. And so you have less flexibility, but at the same time, it's more long-winded. I think for a related reason, that is to say, because words have a narrow meaning, you have to use more of them to say something precise.
That's interesting.
And so you have... there's a slowness to writing in French that you don't get in English in quite the same way.
Yeah, you said long-winded, but I feel like there must be a better word for it.
Well, that's slightly pejorative, and I shouldn't have used it. But the slower, I think, and also denser. French is denser than English as a structure, as a written structure. So
to answer your question earlier, I am just tremendously curious what French language writer Mary writes about. You know, it's as if it's a box. One of the other reasons to write in French is that I have the sense, I live in Quebec City, which has this wonderful literary scene, and so I see these gifted writers in French surrounding me. I can go to their readings and I can read their works, and I want to talk to them. You know, I want to have
in their
conversation
language.
with them. Yes.
Yeah.
I want to be part of that conversation, and so that's the other reason. So, yeah.
So maybe that's enough
probably
for today.
What are we talking about next week?
So we talked about doing communities, because you're very engaged with communities, and I have other communities that I engage with. So I think that would be very interesting.
So do join us for that.
Don't forget to click on the button below if you'd like to subscribe to the series. We seem to be producing these at a regular rate, so I think we're going to be around for a while doing these podcasts.
We'll try to keep that up.
See you next time.
See you next time.